we all know the famous line. It's a little bit changed. It's originally a Yiddish story called Tevya the Milkman by Shalom Aleichem. That later became the theatrical production, Fiddler on the Roof. Then it became a film in 1971. In the film version, Tevya the Milkman turns to God after one of the common but not so friendly visits by the local Cossacks, and he says, God, I know you chose us, but couldn't you choose someone else once in a while? And this is of course where we begin, because the Jewish people certainly have had more than their share of trouble that is somehow related to their uniqueness. But really, we should begin with the premise that the idea that a ethnicity, nation, neighborhood, fans of a particular sports team hold that they are somehow better than everyone else, that they are somehow unique and of a quality that no other person has, is actually pretty common throughout the world. To this day, there are societies that are pretty, they're pretty convinced that they're fundamentally more superior and of better culture and of greater intelligence, or frankly, their lives of more value than others. Certainly it exists in many corners of America, of citizens of the United States. It's certainly a part of large swaths of those who live in France. A particular sense of superiority is an intrinsic part in Japanese society, which they're not in the least bit apologetic about. And it goes deeper than that. Many societies, for many years, have this premise that the true human being, who the rules of law and decency apply to, are only those people who belong to their culture. In the United States, for many years, it was whites and not blacks. In the ancient Greek city-states, who, by virtue of their military prowess, economic success, and advanced culture, consider themselves superior to the barbarians around them, to be protected by the law was only for those who were citizens of your polis, of your city-state, and those city-states who were allied with yours. But someone who was from outside, if they weren't adopted and put under the protection of someone with citizen status in your city-state, they had no rights, and both their lives and property were for the taking. In the Roman Empire, there was a profound difference in the status of Roman citizens who merited protection under the rule of law, and those who were not Roman citizens who did not merit any such protection, on the whole had no recourse. We have the phenomenon of, for example, whether Nazi Germany or the Ottoman Empire during the genocide of the Kurds during World War I, even of Bosnia during the troubles of the early 90s, where within those societies the rule of law obtained, and you didn't steal things, and people were punished for criminal activity, whereas the other, who was considered less than human, whether it be the Bosnian Muslims or Jews and other outcasts in Nazi Germany, whether it be blacks in the Deep South, the rule of law did not apply to them, and one could take their property, abuse them, and even kill them with relative impunity, because they were considered as less than human. Or more correctly, the only real human being are those who belong to your particular society. So this type of prejudice, or as coined appropriately by a Frenchman of that name, this type of chauvinism is not uncommon, and it's pretty pervasive, and there's no question, and I should begin with this, that it exists among Jews too. In other words, Jews are, however, different people like anyone else, and this particular ethnic chauvinism exists indubitably among Jews. But, as we shall see, this has nothing to do with the premise of chosenness that we are going to discuss that exists in Judaic texts. There's a fundamental, and one of the very interesting, as if it were proofs of this, is that because chauvinism is by definition ethnic, in other words, it relates to people who grew up with you, however you define them, by race, by language, by a common ancestry, is on the whole the case with Jews. It's interesting to note that the Torah, in about a dozen places, admonishes us to be extra careful to treat the convert to Judaism no different than ourselves. And the reason for this is quite simple, because the convert will often not be of your race, certainly not of your ethnicity. He or she will pronounce their Hebrew funny, and probably don't speak the language as you. Culturally, they may be very different, because there's all kinds of features to every Jewish community that are cultural, not religious in nature. So there's a sense to see them as another, because all the tests by which human societies commonly apply to define this, us and the other, would place the convert in the category of the other. But we are told to understand that the definition of us in Judaism is entirely different, and they are fundamentally the same and no different than you. But the reason the Torah has to warn us about this so many times is because otherwise they would fall prey to the propensity to ostracize, or at least to view as second class, someone who was an other, who was not of your community. And you see this with a very interesting phenomenon, that the less knowledgeable of Judaism and the less involved in day-to-day Jewish life people are, the more they are skeptical about the actual efficacy of a conversion. In other words, you'll talk to people who are ethnically Jewish but not necessarily terribly knowledgeable or involved, and they'll say, yeah, I know this so-and-so went through a conversion, but they're obviously not really Jewish. And that is why this same cohort is willing to accept rather superficial conversions, because they don't really believe a conversion is effective. They don't really believe a conversion does anything. It satisfies, some religious or social need, but they don't see it as real. And you see this. The more committed people are, the more they're willing to accept the idea that this person is one of us, the less, and it's quite simple. Because the definition of peoplehood that relates to the concept of chosenness that exists in Judaism is not a simple statement of ethnic superiority and chauvinism. And because of that, the natural ethnic superiority and chauvinism. Thank you, Yosef. Thank you very much. That we all share. So please, everyone, take one. That we all share exists by Jews, but has nothing to do with the doctrine of chosenness. Which brings us, before we start looking at the text, to the next important introduction for tonight's theme. And that is that if we look carefully at the text we're going to look at tonight, and if we think about it at length, we discover something very interesting. And this isn't new. It's not 20th century, it's not even 19th century. There is a discomfort among Jews about this concept of being called the chosen people that we're always challenging ourselves with. Some people in this group once did such an experiment with non-Jewish friends of theirs who weren't terribly nonplussed by the idea that Jews are chosen for a purpose and given a particular, shall we say, more intense quality of soul for this purpose. And in general, the concept of chosenness bothers Jews far more than it bothers non-Jews, unless you're, hardcore anti-Semites, but that's not what we're talking about. So the question is, why does it bother us so much? It doesn't bother the Japanese, it doesn't bother the French, it doesn't bother, most of the United States between the coasts, who have this fundamental, broad cultural sense that, America is a superior culture and morally superior to the rest of the world. Irrespective of whether it's true or not, they believe it. I'm not saying it isn't true. I'm saying that they believe it. And it doesn't bother a whole range of people, both historically and to this very day. So, there's a very famous story that before trains ruined it and allowed the common people to come, Bar Harbor in Maine, which you basically got to by boat, was the exclusive province of the people who saw themselves as the aristocracy of the United States. So there's a story told about someone from a rather distinguished Boston family, but not as old or distinguished as some of the other families who dwelled there. But she once, her horse bolted and her carriage turned over, so she's lying in the middle of the road. And two very important, in their own eyes, women from way back Philadelphia families come by, and they look at her lying on the road. One gets out, looks at her carefully, and says, and says, "We don't know her." And she gets back in, and they drive off, and they waited for she has to wait for someone else to come pick her up from the side of the road, because it wouldn't do for them to deal with someone who's not of their esteemed social quality. And you see this, there are numerous stories like this throughout history. At any rate, the reality is that it bothers us. And the reason it bothers us is because once you understand what we were actually chosen for, you will see that a concept of aristocracy, which means that I'm better because I'm privileged to be better. In other words, an aristocracy of privilege, a chosenness of privilege, is precisely what Judaism is not. And therefore, what happens is that any time the concept of sort of unearned, undeserved privilege for one's own benefit. So the definition of the chauvinism that exists throughout humanity, and again can exist in the Jewish community, though the Torah tells us to avoid it, is a sense of intrinsic privilege that is unearned and is to the benefit of the privileged class. Now let us see where Judaism differs and what it means when Hashem tells us that we are a chosen people. And indeed, the actual term of Bechira, of chosen, really appears most strongly in the liturgy of the 7th or 8th centuries. The actual terms used in the Torah and prophets are somewhat different, as we shall see. So we'll begin, not coincidentally, but divine providence. This is this week's Torah portion that we're going to read this Shabbat, where the Jewish people are introduced. In other words, until Abraham, you have humanity, and humanity ends up with a completely corrupt state, which brings about the flood. Then there's the episode of the Tower of Babel. And then we have Abraham. We read a little bit about Abraham last week, and now we're going to read a lot more about it. So this week's Torah portion begins with the words, text 1, Vayomer Hashem al Avram, Hashem told Avram, as he was called, then Lech Lecha, go for you, Me'artzecha, from your land, Me'ladetzecha, from your birthplace, the base of Vicha, from your father's house, Elo Eretz Asher Areka, to the land that I'll show you. So what's clear is that Avram is leaving all the categories that he had, Sarah, of course, Sarai as she was called then. Avram and Sarai are leaving all the categories that they previously had, of nationhood, of family, and so on. They're completely leaving behind any description, any definition. The Esechai will make you l'goy gadol, to a great nation. V'avarech echa, and I will bless you. V'gadla shemecha, I will make your name great. V'yei bracha, and you will become a blessing. V'avarecha v'avarech echa, and I will bless them that bless you. V'kalalecha, and those who curse you, or I will curse, says God. V'nivruchu b'cha, and they will be blessed through you, in you, kol mishpachot adamah, all the families of the earth. So what do we have over here? We have on one hand that God is separating Abraham and his subsequent descendants, because he's going to make him into a nation, from all of humanity that exists up to that point. On the other hand, what is the purpose of that? That you should become a great nation, and great is in the spiritual and moral sense. But the goal is you should be a blessing. It doesn't say that Yeh Gadol will be great. You will be fortunate. You will be wonderful. You will be privileged. You'll be a bracha. A bracha, by definition, is a blessing, is a flow of benefits that comes from the blesser, whether it be the God or the priests or Avraham, to the people, to others. In other words, the definition of this greatness, the definition of this mission, the definition of this purpose is something which on one hand demands greatness and uniqueness and a quality which transcends a quality of greatness, of spirituality that is transcendent of and deeper than and more powerful than that possessed by anyone else. But not for the purpose of privilege, not for the purpose of creating an isolated group of perfect people who then will go on to be the goal of humanity, and everyone else can, as they say in Yiddish, gay in the erd, can be sunk into the ground, we don't care. But rather, this greatness exists for the purpose, v'heyei bracha, of being a blessing, of being the source of blessing for all the families of the earth.
So in these sentences, essentially, God has chosen. He has made his choice.
He's made his choice in Abraham.
But he made his choice in Abraham.
But for what purpose?
Of creating a nation.
That is a source of blessing. So now we have to. The next text will elaborate on this more. But we first have to take a moment and understand something about the Torah's account of the history of humanity up to here. What happened? So God creates the human race and gives them a mission. Don't eat from the tree. Adam and Chava, they eat from the tree. Then God, and that's all of humanity. Then God gives them children and so on, and a huge nation, a huge people grow up, and they become utterly corrupt in every possible way. Most importantly, they have the war of all against all. The world is full of theft and violence, of robbery and violence, which the Torah calls chamas in Hebrew, a complete accident, but nevertheless, there's the word. And at that point, God destroys the world and all the living things in it, and saves Noah. And says, "Okay, get it right this time." So what do? Exactly what they did wrong. Building the Tower of Babel is an entirely different subject for our Torah class. But the key point is that they somehow united in doing precisely what God didn't want them to do. Now, here's the issue. Why does this happen? The simple reason this happens is because the intrinsic value of humanity is that it has free choice. The whole point of creating human beings is that they're going to do hopefully they're going to choose to do what's right by their own choice. And as if it were, God said, hey, I choose to need you to do the right thing. So once humanity has chosen so many times, and there's fundamental ongoing effects from this, to do the wrong thing, so now we have an issue. We can't force humanity to do the right thing. God can't force humanity to do the right thing, because if God forces humanity to do the right thing, then they might as well be robots, they might as well not exist. It has to be free. But conversely, there needs to, as the years go by and everyone gets sunk more and more into their particular narrow and often erroneous cultural beliefs, both with regards to their relationship to God and to other human beings, there needs to be the capacity for people who want to seek the truth, however long of a journey it is, to find it. So God says, okay, I'm going to create a people who, to a certain extent, they'll have free will, but I'm going to create a people whose job it is to carry this message, and by circumstance will not ever really abandon it. Because as we know, that in case we choose to forget that we are Jews, and without, God forbid, going into any claims of justifying all our suffering, God owes us an answer, and we expect one at some point in history. But the bottom line is that if we choose to forget that we are Jews and that we have a particular mission and that we are different in that sense, we will be reminded of it. One of the most powerful reasons we're still here is because people always felt obliged to remind us, whether it's the rest of the Middle East to the Jews in Israel, whether it's even in the completely egalitarian utopia of the Soviet Union. They still stamped a Jew in your passport and told you that your real homeland was however you pronounce it, Bigotry, right? And so on and so forth. And and there were quotas, and that's why my friend Professor Braunover ended up in studying magnetohydrodynamics rather than physics, because the quota of whatever it was, 6 Jewish graduate students for the University of Moscow in physics was filled, and so on and so forth. And and as a matter of fact, where we're not reminded of that, that's where we have the biggest problem. The Jewish community in greatest danger in many ways is the broader American Jewish community, and what is happening to it, though I expect that it won't disappear like the Chinese one did, is China had no prejudice. In the Middle Ages, there was no prejudice, there was no oppression, there was complete acceptance. There were no laws against doing any business, marrying any Chinese citizen, and so on. And the Jewish community was extremely successful, the Jewish community of Kaifeng, and within 300 years it completely disappeared. I'm not suggesting that oppression is a good thing. I'm making the point that historically, God, as if it were, has programmed history in such a way that the Jews as a whole don't get to forget that there's always some Jews who are forced to remember they're Jews, either by internal or external pressure. Why is this important? This is important because this is, in a sense, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs actually is very interesting. He spoke about this at a Catholic university in Connecticut. I was there at the event. So the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sachs, made the interesting point that sort of God needed to cook the books a little bit, not his words, but needed to weigh the scales a little bit by creating a people who would carry this truth for the sake of humanity in such a way that they won't forget it. So no matter where humanity wanders, there'll always be this little, literally this ark in which the truth is held. And of course we have broad free will, but the one thing that collectively we don't have is the ability to forget that we're Jews as a nation. It won't ever, that's what we're guaranteed, that it won't ever happen. So this, and indeed, we find that when God wants to destroy the city of Sodom for its wickedness, he says, I got to talk to Abraham first. I got to give Abraham a chance to speak up for them, because they're his responsibility. God gives responsibility, and this is something that is often hidden in the Tanakh and in Jewish history. But every once in a while it comes out. When God begins with Abraham, he says, look, you have responsibility for the whole world. And as we'll see soon, in Yeshayahu's visions of Achrit HaYamim, of the end of days, of the perfected universe, we're also going to see a vision, a collective vision. Meanwhile, throughout history, we also have to be reminded not to be diluted, not to allow ourselves to be assimilated and absorbed in the world around us, because then we're no good. It's as we shall see in a moment. And from this we come to God's very specific instructions to a people, already a people, when God is getting ready to give the Torah to the Jewish people, make a covenant with them and really make them Jews. Because the people who left Egypt were Abraham's descendants, but they weren't yet the Jewish people until they made a covenant. All the Jewish people essentially converted to Judaism at Sinai. And this is what happens. That's why people often will raise questions. People sometimes will raise questions and say, wait a second, various figures in the Bible, Moses among them, had wives from other nations and so on. It doesn't make a difference, because no one was really Jewish legally until Sinai. And at Sinai, everyone who was there became Jewish. So at any rate, so Hashem says to the Jewish people, text 2, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And therefore, if you'll listen to my voice and keep my covenant, what is the covenant? You shall be my own treasure. The Hebrew word is segula, which means not just a treasure, but something with a unique, efficacious quality. In other words, the word segula in biblical and rabbinic Hebrew means a particular quality. So, for example, gold doesn't tarnish. That's one of its segulot. It's also heavy. A diamond will reflect multiple spectra of light. That's its segula. And there are herbs that have segulot. They calm you, they heal you, they bring your fever down. The segula is a particular efficacious quality of some object or substance. That's what it means. So you'll be for me a treasure. It doesn't mean that you'll be valuable, that you will be, valuable because you're valuable. You're segula, you're my treasure. You have an efficacious quality that affects those beyond you. Because for me is the whole earth. And the question is, why is God is choosing a particular group of people in the Sinai desert or wherever it was, to be his unique people? Why does God have to say, for mine is the whole world? Why is that relevant? I'm choosing you. To mine is this little patch of real estate. Mine is this mountain. Mine is you. But the answer is because what is your segula? What is your treasure? What is your quality? Your capacity to ultimately bring goodness, to ultimately transform the whole earth. The whole earth is mine, so I need a people who will accept upon themselves, as the Jewish people did at Sinai, and by mystical tradition, all of our souls were there, every burden, every challenge, every difficulty, in order to ultimately bring the world to where the world needs to be. And to do so, I'm giving you a treasure, I'm giving you unique quality of soul. As we've discussed here, the mystics explain that a Jew absolutely does have a unique quality of godly soul, a unique quality of divine energy within them that is different and more intense than that of any other nation. Now, if someone were to say, that's unfair, the answer quite simply is, if you want the burden, and you want the challenge, and you want the difficulty, and you really yearn for it, even though, as we'll see momentarily, God is perfectly happy to see the good in any person who chooses to do what's right, and You're not better off by having a more difficult task. If you really feel driven to it and you're willing to undergo all the pain and challenge and difficulty, you're welcome to join. There's no rules against it. But in the end, I'm giving you this unique quality because the whole earth is mine, and I need you as if it were to ultimately cause the fixing of the whole earth. And he goes on to say, "V'atem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." You shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. Hashem tells Moshe. Now, these last two statements are crucial to understanding this whole idea. What is a kohen? A priest. Who were the kohanim in ancient Israel up to this day? They were people set aside. They were given privileges. All the Jewish people who are each under their fig tree and under their vine have to give a percentage of everything they grow to the Kohanim, so that the Kohanim are free to do God's service. The Kohanim are the ones who bring all the sacrifices. They were very often, because they were free, the teachers of the Jewish people, but they are the ones who facilitate an ordinary Jew being able to walk into the temple, bring an offering, and having a profound spiritual experience. The Kohanim are holy. They're not allowed to become impure. They have all kinds of rules that no one else has, and they're privileged. A Kohen is spiritually has as if it were a profound and direct connection to God in a way that other Jewish people do not have. That's why the Kohanim are given the task of blessing the people. God says, "I bless them." But to this day, it's one of the last things the Kohanim have until the temple's rebuilt. The Kohanim bless us each holiday in Israel every day, or certainly every Shabbat. And what is this blessing? They are uniquely transparent lenses for God's blessing in a way that no ordinary person can do. But at the same time, they have a greater task, and they have greater restrictions upon them. They have many things that they cannot do, such as becoming, such as be given inheritance in the land, such as getting a portion of the spoils of war, such as becoming impure, coming in contact with a dead body, which is a huge inconvenience in many ways, and they're limited in who they can marry, and so on and so forth. All these limitations exist. Now, can a Jew become a Kohen? No, a regular Jew cannot become a Kohen. The Kohanim are given certain privileges, certain spiritual powers, because they are there to serve the whole Jewish people. The Jewish people have to get their fingers dirty and till the earth and wage war and build a nation. So you need people entirely immersed in spirituality to be able to facilitate and open the door for someone who wants to leave their earthiness and connect with godliness. You need people in this unique position. So when who do the Kohanim exist for? To serve God and to serve the Jewish people. Who do the Jewish people exist for if they're a kingdom of priests? To serve God and to serve the rest of humanity. If we're Kohanim, we have to be a Kohen to someone. Again, Kohen is not an aristocracy. It is a privilege to serve. Who are you serving? The whole world. And furthermore, it says, Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. The word holy is a very bad translation of the word Kadosh. If I give you the word holy, what's the word in Russian for holy? How would you describe that word? Sacred. What does sacred mean? What does holy mean?
Close to God.
What?
Close to God.
Close to God.
Not sinful person.
Not sinful, pure. In other words, a state of spiritual perfection. But in Hebrew, the word kadosh is used if you plant certain plants together, and those plants, you're not allowed to plant those plants together. So the Torah says that if you do, pentikdash hamalei, everything that grows becomes kadosh. Doesn't mean holy. It means it becomes separated. You can't eat it. You have to burn it. Someone who is the Torah warns us against allowing prostitution to exist among the Jewish people. What is a prostitute? A kadesha. Why? Because she's separated from everyone else for this purpose. And it's particularly talking about the sacred prostitutes that existed in the Near East at the time. The word kadosh means separated. It can be separated for the bad, or separated for the good. The word kadosh means, and what does it mean? It means something that is ordinary but separated. These are ordinary vegetables, but now you can't eat them, even though they look, typically all vegetables are kosher. These vegetables are separated and can't be eaten. So what is kadosh? So you sanctify something, you make something holy, you offer it to the temple. You're separating it. It's a kal like any other kal, but now you're bringing it to the Beit HaMikdash. It's a handful of flour like any other handful of flour. You're bringing it to the temple. Shabbat is a day with 24 hours in which the sun moves along the zodiacal arc. Just under 1 degree, a bit over 1 degree actually. It's a day like any other day, but it's different. It's separated. It's set aside. When we're told to sanctify ourselves with kosher food, that means it's like any other food, but food is food. Food is energy. We separate certain foods out and eat them in a certain way and prepare them in a certain way. So the word kedusha means to separate something that otherwise is exactly the same. We're human beings. We have hands and feet and livers and brains, and in no way is different or superior to any other human being. But v'goy kadosh, God separates us out for a given purpose. Now, kedusha also includes this idea of separating ourselves to follow the covenant. In other words, we don't believe there's anything wrong with someone who isn't Jewish not observing the laws of the Torah, as we'll see a note at the end of our texts. But we are obliged to separate ourselves out, and in order to maintain that light, to maintain that truth, to maintain the essence of the unity and goodness that God seeks that all humanity ultimately take, to preserve it and ultimately, when possible, to give it out. Sometimes our light is hidden. One of the reasons, as I mentioned, Yeshayahu talks about this at the end of days. We talk about the beginning of the Jewish people, but a lot of the rest of the Jewish people, the Tanakh spends a lot of time admonishing us not to be like the idol worshippers around us. A lot of the Talmud is spent on making sure that we don't simply assimilate into and behave like the non-Jews among us. And indeed, throughout Jewish history, one of the great emphases was, as if it were, making sure there's a distance between us and non-Jews. And it's quite simple. Jews were oppressed. Jews were disadvantaged. And it was very important. In other words, these are all true. But the truth that was most important in, say, 1750 or even 1850 was that Jews are different, because any Jew who wanted to convert to Christianity throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern era, and right up until the 20th century, say in the Russian Empire, all the doors were open for them. The intense thing we need to know is that we are special, that we are different, and that we cannot betray our mission by becoming part of everyone else. As we get closer to the redemption, as we move into a point in history where most Jews live in places where they're free to practice their Judaism and free to say what they'd like, the other aspect, which is that you are separated for the purpose of teaching and illuminating and elevating the world, that we have to let that light out. And that is what becomes more and more the emphasis. They're both true, as we'll see in a moment. They're both true. But at this point in history, it's the second that needs to become strong. Not at the expense of being who we are, but with the understanding that there's no longer any need, any necessity to hide anything that we have to teach that might be a benefit to any human being on this planet. And with that, before we go to Yeshayahu, let me make the point that whether it be monotheism, whether it be the premise that women are not property, whether it be a premise that children have rights, whether it be the premise that economic power does not give you the ability to treat people who are perforce need to be employed by you any way you like, the premise that the that that anything we possess for the purpose of the whole, and therefore charity is not a virtuous choice, but an obligation that we ought to make each other fulfill, and so on. All these ideas. We live in a world where there's a premise that people in the workplace have rights, that women are not property, that children are to be protected, that people ought not to be arbitrarily discriminated against, that punishments not be unduly, to use the term from the Constitution, cruel and unusual, that we assume a fundamental right to life and property for every person as much as the human being. The Torah is the first to legislate the rights of aliens. Every one of these ideas that are so common in our society, they all have their original source in the Torah. They all come from the Torah, not to mention ideas of monotheism and so on. The idea that one ought to protect and care for the disabled, physically and mentally, is an entirely Jewish idea that in the ancient world Jews were mocked for, and which has ultimately, of course, become an intrinsic part of our societies. I think it's not I, and it's not a Jew who said it, it's John Adams, who lived not far from here, who said it, that he spent several years trying to raise loans for the United States and Holland, the new country. And there he came into contact with quite a few Jews. So in one of his letters to Abigail, he writes that no nation has done more to civilize humanity than the Jewish people. And it is apropos of this. Not to mention, the concepts of the spiritual value of every individual, as we'll see in a moment in one of the further texts. All these ideas have their roots in Judaism, and many of them have gone by osmosis, by people seeing what we say and reading our texts. But now we're in a position where we absolutely can and must actively and aggressively share them. Again, we don't seek to convert anyone to Judaism, but we seek to share what we have. And this balance between the covenant, which means that we remain within ourselves, and illumination, you might say, look, let's illuminate the whole world. Why should we have barriers? Why should we be different? Why can't I just sit down at any restaurant and eat with my coworkers and drink wine with them? Why can't I marry just about anyone? And the answer lies that a Kohen who lives, a priest who lives like everyone else, is of no use to the everyone else. And the person, you can imagine what would happen. It's okay if you have a drink or two. It's not okay if the pilot of your 747 has a drink or two. It's okay if you have a little tremor in your hand and you drive a car, because the modern automobile will dampen that tremor. But it's not okay if you're doing brain surgery with a little tremor in your hand. When you have a challenge, when you have an obligation, when you have a mission that is very demanding, more is demanded of you. And that demands a purity and withdrawal and concentration on yourself. By way of example, let us celebrate the miracle of artificial light. Normally, it wouldn't be so easy to make such a gathering in days of gone, in the evening, because we'd have to get candles, and a lot of candles, and they'd be expensive, and we might burn up a piano or so on. Now we have the miracle of artificial light. So look at that fluorescent light bulb up there. It's very bright. The light, the gases inside are fluorescing as they ought to. That gives us plenty of light. So if someone will say, it's a pity Why should all the light be concentrated in that tube? Let's smash the tube and let the light out. Let it fill the room. There'll be even more light. The answer is there'll be less light, and everyone will get cuts from the glass. And what?
There'll be no light.
There'll be no light. And in addition, you'll get injured. In the injured, you'll get injured.
Right.
Because the whole reason that can give light is because it exists in a concentrated environment, because the gas is held in, because the electricity can pass through it, but it's a transparent tube that lets that light out. When the Jewish people seek to live and become like everyone else, they're not just harming themselves, they're harming everyone else. Because now they don't have that advantage, that sharing, that inspiration, that it's our job to give the world. So we benefit no one and instead hurt everyone. So there is no love of humanity. There is no egalitarian virtue in breaking down that barrier of the covenant that we have within ourselves. We're only hurting all of humanity that we claim to love and want to embrace. It's strong words, but a young man from South America once went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said, "Look, I fall in love with this non-Jewish woman, and I want to marry her." So the Rebbe says, "I don't doubt." The Rebbe said, "I don't doubt for a moment that you love her, and because you love her, you won't marry her, because you cannot create a Jewish family with her, and there'll be a fundamental conflict in the sense that you're not doing what you need to, and not letting her do what her mission is and what she needs to do. And in your union, you're only harming each other. Each of us has our mission, we need to do it, and if you truly love someone, you won't harm them by taking away their potential to do what it is that they need to do."
My question is that, so, I mean, you beautifully explained that, in the beginning of history and in the Middle Ages, Jews, due to Torah and the teaching of rabbis, had this strong authority. But what about the situation now? I mean, in all honesty, I cannot say that at present Jews as a group, as a whole, have more moral values in comparison to other developed societies. So, using your example, it's like, the lamp in the darkness is one thing, but the lamp in the broad light is a totally different thing. I mean, how can we say now that we're carrying moral values to other developed nations? Whereas,
Well, I think it's very clear. One of the most fundamental moral values is the understanding, and this goes when we'll speak about the Noahide laws in a moment. The fundamental essence of all morality is that it comes from an authority that isn't subject to debate. That there's an absolute morality that flows from the Creator of the universe. That absolute morality is not just the Torah. It's also the laws that God gave Noah and asked Abraham and Moses to get the Jewish people to share with the world. Those laws are absolute, and they come from the idea that the only source of morality is the Creator of the universe, so as if it were, He's the source of the universe. Because if morality flows from human ideas, which is the premise that obtains still in many developed societies, there are always exceptions to the rule. So, so Nazi Germany said Jews were the exceptions to the rule. They were the most advanced, most cultured, most philosophically developed, most scientifically developed society on the face of the earth. They were ahead of everyone else. But without a fundamental moral authority, they made up their own things, as did the communists, and frankly, as exists in this society. Many of the problems that still exist in our own society are a function of the fact that people do not believe that there is an absolute source to morality, and therefore they live with relative morality. We can look at the collapse of 2008 and so on. And quite frankly, that Jews were involved in that is somewhat irrelevant, because a Jew who doesn't follow God's teachings is in just as bad shape morally as a non-Jew does, not perhaps worse, because more is expected of them. If we look around the world, if we look at the idea that you get to create your own idea of God, and therefore that premise that God you create lets you go around murdering people in large numbers, that certainly still needs fixing. And again, the only way out of this is a single conception of God with a single set of morals that is incumbent upon all of humanity by virtue of the fact that it comes from the ultimate creator and authority of all humanity. And that is missing in all of Europe. It's missing to a great deal in our own country. It's missing in a lot of the world. And that still needs to be done. In other words, let's be quite blunt. The fact that you can walk down Fifth Avenue, which is the most expensive real estate in the world, and see homeless people sleeping on the steps of various churches and the like, the fact that so much dishonesty took place and takes place within the financial sector, the fact that we live in a society of profound demagoguery and political corruption and manipulation of what ought to be good in matters of social justice, etc. The fact that we live in a world in which we condone evil if it comes from people with a lot of oil. Every one of those things is a violation of the Noahide laws, and a violation, and something that we still have to fix, and we still have to teach about, and we still have to speak about. The fact, this was something my own Rebbe, my own teacher, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was very into, the fact that we incarcerate millions and millions of people and haven't figured out a better way of dealing with the issues of the underclass is a violation of what Hashem commanded Jewish people. So if we look at the world has profound problems whose solution lies within the Torah.
Right, but I cannot say that Jews take a leader position in doing all that. I mean, Fifth Avenue is no different from Dizengoff, right? I mean, and I have the feeling that other nations made a big progress from Middle Ages to nowadays. Well, Jews, respect, they pretty much stay at the same level. So we cannot serve the source of light anymore.
That's not only is that not true. If you look at Jewish communities, that for all the troubles and scandals and so on, if you look at Jewish communities who are observant of all or parts of their Judaism, Jews are, and this is a fact, a statistical fact, far more generous in their charity giving than any other ethnicity upon the face of this earth. Israel has extended itself for all its secularism and all the empty spaces of its Judaism. It has extended itself to bring in people that it has felt an obligation to, its fellow Jews and some others, in a way that what other third world country with a broken economy took in 1 million Israelis, took in another 1 million people in the 50s, 60s, and continued to do so. And quite frankly, given its enormous burden of military budget, and given the fact that there are many rich people in Israel, and it's a successful economy, but by no means yet on a Western European or American level, Israel has a pretty of all the countries in its per capita GDP, it has a better and more aggressive safety net than any of those countries. And the answer lies that a Kohen a priest who lives like everyone else, is of no use to the everyone else. And the person, you can imagine what would happen. It's okay if you have a drink or two. It's not okay if the pilot of your 747 has a drink or two. It's okay if you have a little tremor in your hand and you drive a car, because the modern automobile will dampen that tremor. But it's not okay if you're doing brain surgery with a little tremor in your hand. when you have a challenge, when you have an obligation, when you have a mission that is very demanding, more is demanded of you. And that demands a purity and withdrawal and concentration on yourself. By way of example, let us celebrate the miracle of artificial light. Normally, it wouldn't be so easy to make such a gathering in days of gone, in the evening, because we'd have to get candles, and a lot of candles, and they'd be expensive, and we might burn up a piano or so on. Now we have the miracle of artificial light. So look at that fluorescent light bulb up there. It's very bright. The light, the gases inside are fluorescing as they ought to. That gives us plenty of light. So if someone will say, it's a pity, why should all the light be concentrated in that tube? Let's smash the tube and let the light out. Let it fill the room. There'll be even more light. The answer is there'll be less light, and everyone will get cuts from the glass. And what?
There'll be no light.
There'll be no light. And in addition, you'll get injured. In the injured, you'll get injured.
Right.
Because the whole reason that can give light is because it exists in a concentrated environment, because the gas is held in, because the electricity can pass through it, but it's a transparent tube that lets that light out. When the Jewish people seek to live and become like everyone else, they're not just harming themselves, they're harming everyone else, because now they don't have that advantage, that sharing, that inspiration, that it's our job to give the world. So we benefit no one and instead hurt everyone. So there is no love of humanity. There is no egalitarian virtue in breaking down that barrier of the covenant that we have within ourselves. We're only hurting all of humanity that we claim to love and want to embrace. It's strong words, but a young man from South America once went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said, look, I fall in love with this non-Jewish woman, and I want to marry her. So the Rebbe says, I don't doubt. The Rebbe said, I don't doubt for a moment that you love her. And because you love her, you won't marry her. Because you cannot create a Jewish family with her, and there'll be a fundamental conflict in the sense that you're not doing what you need to, and not letting her do what her mission is and what she needs to do. And in your union, you're only harming each other. Each of us has our mission, we need to do it, and if you truly love someone, you won't harm them by taking away their potential to do what it is that they need to do.
My question is that, so, I mean, you beautifully explained that, in the beginning of history and in the Middle Ages, Jews, due to Torah and the teaching of rabbis, had this strong authority. But what about the situation now? I mean, in all honesty, I cannot say that at present Jews as a group, as a whole, have more moral values in comparison to other developed societies. So, using your example, it's the lamp in the darkness is one thing, but the lamp in the broad light is a totally different thing. I mean, how can we say now that we're carrying moral values to other developed nations? Whereas,
Well, I think it's very clear. One of the most fundamental moral values is the understanding, and this goes when we'll speak about the Noahide laws in a moment. The fundamental essence of all morality is that it comes from an authority that isn't subject to debate. That there's an absolute morality that flows from the Creator of the universe. That absolute morality is not just the Torah. It's also the laws that God gave Noah and asked Abraham and Moses to get the Jewish people to share with the world. Those laws are absolute, and they come from the idea that the only source of morality is the Creator of the universe, so as if it were, He's the source of the universe. Because if morality flows from human ideas, which is the premise that obtains still in many developed societies, there are always exceptions to the rule. So, so Nazi Germany said Jews were the exceptions to the rule. They were the most advanced, most cultured, most philosophically developed, most scientifically developed society on the face of the earth. They were ahead of everyone else. But without a fundamental moral authority, they made up their own things, as did the communists, and frankly, as exists in this society. Many of the problems that still exist in our own society are a function of the fact that people do not believe that there is an absolute source to morality, and therefore they live with relative morality. We can look at the collapse of 2008 and so on. And quite frankly, that Jews were involved in that is somewhat irrelevant, because a Jew who doesn't follow God's teachings is in just as bad shape morally as a non-Jew does, not perhaps worse, because more is expected of them. If we look around the world, if we look at the idea that you get to create your own idea of God, and therefore that premise that God you create lets you go around murdering people in large numbers, that certainly still needs fixing. And again, the only way out of this is a single conception of God with a single set of morals that is incumbent upon all of humanity by virtue of the fact that it comes from the ultimate creator and authority of all humanity. And that is missing in all of Europe. It's missing to a great deal in our own country. It's missing in a lot of the world. And that still needs to be done. In other words, let's be quite blunt. The fact that you can walk down Fifth Avenue, which is the most expensive real estate in the world, and see homeless people sleeping on the steps of various churches and the like, the fact that so much dishonesty took place and takes place within the financial sector, the fact that we live in a society of profound demagoguery and political corruption and manipulation of what ought to be good in matters of social justice, etc. The fact that we live in a world in which we condone evil if it comes from people with a lot of oil. Every one of those things is a violation of the Noahide laws, and a violation, and something that we still have to fix, and we still have to teach about, and we still have to speak about. The fact, this was something my own Rebbe, my own teacher, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was very into, the fact that we incarcerate millions and millions of people and haven't figured out a better way of dealing with the issues of the underclass is a violation of what Hashem commanded Jewish people. So if we look at the world has profound problems whose solution lies within the Torah.
Right, but I cannot say that Jews take a leader position in doing all that. I mean, Fifth Avenue is no different from Dizengoff, right? I mean, and I have the feeling that other nations made a big progress from Middle Ages to nowadays. Well, Jews, respect, they pretty much stay at the same level. So we cannot serve the source of light anymore.
That's not only is that not true. If you look at Jewish communities, that for all the troubles and scandals and so on, if you look at Jewish communities who are observant of all or parts of their Judaism, Jews are, and this is a fact, a statistical fact, far more generous in their charity giving than any other ethnicity upon the face of this earth. Israel has extended itself for all its secularism and all the empty spaces of its Judaism. It has extended itself to bring in people that it has felt an obligation to, its fellow Jews and some others, in a way that what other third world country with a broken economy took in 1 million Israelis, took in another 1 million people in the 50s, 60s, and continued to do so. And quite frankly, given its enormous burden of military budget, and given the fact that there are many rich people in Israel, and it's a successful economy, but by no means yet on a Western European or American level, Israel has a pretty of all the countries in its per capita GDP, it has a better and more aggressive safety net. We're not talking about, a Norway, which is swollen with oil money, with a Sweden that sent all its surplus population to the United States in the late 19th century and has a very narrow economy that feeds its few million people. We're talking about a complicated, there's still issues, the Sephardim and Ethiopians and Haredim, and a lot of poor sectors of the economy and so on. That's first of all. Secondly, if you look at Jewish communities that are driven by the values of the Torah, no other people have such an extensive array of social welfare and the like, and where relevant, even very insular communities make those available to others. The volunteer ambulance corps in New York and Toronto and Montreal don't just pick up Jews off the street and so on and so forth. Just the opposite. I think, in other words, even here in Boston, you come from Israel, or for that matter, South America, or some other part of the United States, because there's a treatment available for your child or your spouse only here in Boston. There's an organization here, the Boston Rebbe runs Rofa. He provides people food and a place to sleep, and helps them find doctors, and helps them find funding, and so on and so forth. And this is repeated. This exists in New York, and Los Angeles, and Chicago, and Houston, where there's a big medical center. This is something quite unique. I don't know any other community that has that kind of commitment. And last of all, it's not just Jews, but it's Judaism. What does the Torah think? If we have a failing, it's that we're satisfied in maintaining the integrity to the extent we can of our own community, and we're not aggressive about what the Torah says about the financial sector, or energy independence, or the ecology, or the matters pertaining to things like the support of corrupt governments and so on. We should be much more aggressive about these things, about the shame of our prison system. These are things we should be much more aggressive about. And frankly, even something that Judaism is strongly against, which is a, shall we say, unlimited assisted suicide. Take a look at what's going on in Holland. There's become a situation where people are pressured all the time, where they're far from ready to die, by their relatives to just kill themselves, so they can stop having to take care of them, and they can go and collect their inheritance and so on. There are all kinds of things going on in the world that the Torah has something to say about, and the world is far from perfect. Not to mention, whether it be a Rwanda or an ISIS, the Torah would speak to the nations of the world that have power and wealth, whether it be Russia, whether it be China, whether it be the US, whether it be the EU, and say, listen, you can't allow this to happen. You have to do something about it. And the fact is that, again, and this is something the Lubavitcher Rebbe has spoken about, we have gotten used to an exile. We have gotten used to being quiet. We have gotten used to surviving ourselves and not aggressively saying, what do we have to teach the world? And it's time to change that. But trust me, I have only cataloged a small list of those things that Jews believe, that Judaism teaches, and that we have the obligation, the same way that we insist that no one be denied medical treatment in our community because they don't have money. And there are numerous charities and so on for this. My own children have benefited from this. We really have an obligation to demand this for the whole society. And that's not a political matter. That's a matter of tzedakah. For the record, I'm not entirely excited about the attempt to do it here, which, in my opinion, could have been done a lot better. That's an irrelevant discussion. I just want to understand this isn't a partisan statement. It's a statement of Jewish law and of Noahide laws that applies to all of humanity.
As Jews moves throughout the world, from the ancient times to Middle Ages and on, the laws that it carries as part of its responsibility, okay, they don't change because they're fixed. All right? It's not like you amend them.
They don't change, but they grow.
Well, all right. But the world changes much faster.
So
All I'm trying to say is that trying to get to that last bit of perfection is always very difficult. You know?
No one says it's easy. God didn't tell
Right.
Abraham it was easy. But the point is, the Jewish law is built on core values,
Right.
not on statutes. So when I say they grow, I mean to say that we can easily amend the laws of privacy to deal with what's going on, with data mining and the NSA and so on, because the Torah doesn't say merely don't look into someone else's window. It says don't interfere with the integrity of someone's privacy. So therefore we have something to say about this issue, as I've been speaking out in various forums and so on throughout the country about it, because we have something to say, and we ought to say it. On this issue and many others, Judaism is the first legal system to create a system of protecting people's privacy, and frankly, from the perspective of Jewish law, the degree of intrusion in people's lives that exists by virtue of technology is something that needs to be fixed. So that's the key. This is a good point, and that's exactly what we need to do. On one hand, we need to be constantly understanding how to extend Jewish law to contemporary issues. And I say Jewish law, I mean the Torah and the Noahide laws, because basically all the laws of human decency are equal between Jewish law and the laws that God gave humanity. And again, we're free to be aggressive and vociferous about it, or we ought to be, yes.
Early Christians rejected the chosenness of the Jews and replaced it with the chosenness of Christians.
Of the church.
Right. And modern Christians do accept the chosenness of Jews, right? In the middle, like the reformers such as Martin Luther, also rejected the chosenness of the Jewish people. So how did it happen that modern Christians accepted the chosenness of the Jews?
The simple answer is that Christianity in its old forms predicted that since we rejected Jesus and all that, we would disappear, except for a small remnant as a reminder of our sin. But the Jews did not disappear. All the attempts to make us disappear, we're here, and more than ever, and more influential than ever. So I think this is just my Judeo-centric take on it. I think a lot of theologians say, well, the Jews aren't disappearing. They're here more than ever, and more than that, they might still have something to teach us. So you need to amend the system to allow for room for the Jewish people to exist in your universe. So some of the more liberal denominations, and by the way, the Catholic Church itself says, wait a second, since Vatican II, they say, as a matter of fact, it's interesting, I didn't know this, but there was a delegation from Edmonton, Canada, in 65, 66, that came to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe and asked him about Vatican II. What did it do? They acknowledged that the Jewish people retained their covenant with God. There's another covenant, that's the church, but the Jewish people who keep the Torah retain their covenant with God. So the Rebbe basically said it doesn't exactly atone for all their sins in the past, but it's a good start. Because what does this do? This allows a very large part of the world, because a very large part of the world is Christian, to open the ears and eyes up and hear what the Torah has to say that's of universal interest. So this is another discussion entirely, but Maimonides sees the evolution in a positive direction of Christianity, Islam, such as it exists. Though we haven't seen it yet in Islam, unfortunately. It seems to be going the other direction, as part of the process of redemption. Which brings us to Isaiah, to Yeshayahu. So, Ubnei HaNechar, so he's talking about the end of days. This is from the Haftarah for a fast day. The next piece is the Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh, which you just read this Shabbat. So So also the aliens that join themselves to Hashem, to minister to Him, and to love the name of Hashem, to be His servants, everyone that keeps the Shabbat profaning, hold fast by my covenant, I'll bring them to my holy mountain, make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offering sacrifice shall be acceptable upon my altar, and my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. In other words, when the ultimate redemption, the Beit HaMikdash is the center not just for the Jewish people and everyone else goes away, but just the opposite. Everyone will reach their spiritual potential. They'll remain who they are. We don't seek to transform everyone into Jews, but they'll realize their potential. That potential is profoundly valuable to God. And the 66 says the same thing, and describes actually, it shall come to pass from one moon to the other, from one Shabbat to the other, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says Hashem. All flesh means all of humanity. How will you do that? Well, maybe through a virtual hookup. The Ger Rebbe, the Imre Emes, in the mid-50s, was asked, how is it possible for all of you, for everyone to show up in the temple every month? He says, with a jet plane. The point being that a lot of this anticipation, and that's a topic for another lecture, all this anticipation of the future suggests a profound development of technology, which is another subject, the technological Mashiach, because the redemption as we see it necessitates an enormous development of technology and human knowledge. It's another discussion. But at any rate, here we get to the key point. Taana Devei Eliyahu, Rabbah chapter 9. In other words, there's a lot about how to keep Jews and non-Jews apart. But what's the ultimate goal? What's the ultimate purpose? So this Midrashic text says, I call heaven and earth as a witness. I testify that anyone, whether Gentile or Jew, man or woman, slave or maidservant, the Holy Spirit, which in Ruach HaKodesh, which means to say the capacity for prophecy, rests upon a person in accordance with their deeds. In other words, every person has the capacity to reach a level of closeness to God that includes this level of prophecy, which we've studied before, which is this level of intense, direct communication with God. Every person, every human being has the ability to reach enormously high levels. They just have different paths to do it. And does the unique characteristic of being a Jew demand unique spiritual energy and power and a soul that is a particularly, shall we say, unveiled manifestation of godliness in a way that others do not have? Yes. But virtue is what you do with what you're given, what you do in your mission. And because God created a critical system, on a spacecraft, the most important item, because you can't afford to bring up too much extra weight. What's the most important item in a spacecraft? Every fitting, every tube, every O-ring, every screw is the most crucial part. Not just the large rocket engines and the computers and so on. If one fails, the whole mission fails. So it might seem that someone has a small part. Whether Jew or not, whether Jew or not Jewish, every human being on the face of this planet has something terribly important to do, that the mission is accomplished to the extent that they do the best they can do as they know. We understand, by the way, and that's part of the fact that we live in a world where communication is now ubiquitous, that we have the ability, going back to your question, to share what previously we didn't. Now we literally can talk to the whole world. Chabad.org, which has an enormous repository of Jewish information, I would say 2/3 of their hits don't come from Jews. And as a matter of fact, there are several thousand hits a year that come from places where we know for sure there are no Jews. I believe the smallest number of hits comes from... No. The smallest number of hits comes from Maldives. You get because there's people who vacation there, but from one of the Emirates, one of the smaller Emirates. I forget which one, but one of those Emirates there were 3 hits last year. But there were 3 people who won. who wanted to read something Jewish on the internet. And you know, when you start talking about countries like Indonesia and Pakistan and so on, I've gotten, you know, when I was doing their Ask the Rabbi for them a few years back, I got a lot of queries from you know, Azerbaijan and Indonesia and you know, and for that matter, you know, Finland, which doesn't exactly have a large Jewish community. So at any rate, all these are the case. So Maimonides goes on to say, talking about the end of days, in that era there will be neither famine nor war, envy or competition, for good will flow in abundance. You won't need a cash economy because there's no need to regulate scarcity, because everything will exist in abundance and renewable fashion. And all the delights will be freely available as dust. One of the things about earth is that it keeps regenerating and producing crops. So a friend of mine in the chemistry field pointed out that Maimonides is suggesting that all these goodies will be renewable, so there won't be any end to them. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. Therefore, the Jews will be great sages, etc. In other words, because again, our job will remain to be teachers, but we anticipate a world in which the whole world will seek a common truth, but each in their own way. And just to conclude, behind this is many ideas, but, you know, someone in 1962, this very well-meaning person wrote the Lubavitcher Rebbe a letter saying, you know, we lost a lot of Jews recently. Judaism is such a wonderful thing. Why don't we actively encourage, you know, everyone else is trying to get converts. Why don't we? So the reason is, each person has a specific mission in this world and a specific set of directives how to behave according to the Torah of God. The Jews have to fulfill the 613 commandments, and the non-Jews, the 7 Noahide laws with all their details, which equal to about 200 odd of the mitzvot. Basically all those that deal between man and God, and some with man and man, and some of those who deal with man and God. There's a very good book by a 19th century Italian rabbi by the name of Benevista, where he describes how the Noahide laws contain within them close to 200 of the other laws. Because if you notice, this is an English letter, and the Rebbe uses 613 commandments, 7 Noahide laws with all their details, because the 7 Noahide laws are not 7 mitzvot. They're broad categories: to believe in God, to not to reject God's authority and providence and goodness, not to murder, not to steal, not to commit acts of sexual immorality, as defined in Noahide laws, which is not the same as in Jewish law. Not to eat a limb from a living animal or inflict other cruelty on animals, and by extension, not to mess around with nature more than necessary. In other words, not to include it in this, as Maimonides, is not to destroy species and so on. And then the obligation to set up courts of justice, which means to say to create a just and equitable society. And that includes things like elders being respected by the younger people. It includes something like charity. Why is charity included in courts of justice? Well, what's the job of a court of justice? To punish those who violate the other laws. What's one of the laws? Theft. So if you don't have a system of social welfare, if someone's hungry and there's no way of making money to feed themselves, it's, the Les Miserables principle. What are you going to do? You're going to go steal a loaf of bread. But how can you punish someone if they have no choice? Because they're trying to preserve their lives. The prohibition against murder is also a prohibition against suicide. And it's an obligation to preserve your life and the life of others. These are all included, all laws in the Torah that are included in the don't murder clause. So you have two laws contradicting each other. The only way to solve that problem is that when we talk about courts of justice, we're talking about a fully functional, just, and equitable system of government which ensures that no one needs to steal because their basic needs are met, and so on. This is just an example of how it works. So, if we understand that, we understand that there is a full, complex, demanding set of laws and obligations that all humanity shares, but all humanity shares them as one. So you can't say, I can't murder someone in my own society, but I can kill someone else. You can't say I can't steal for myself, from our own people, but I can steal from someone next door. Because who's a child of Noah? Every human being. And all humanity is bound to that. In addition, the Jewish people, their capacity as Kohanim, as priests, have additional obligations. But therefore, very rarely, there's only an extremely small number of souls which are destined to convert. And one of the ideas, something that the Rebbe spoke about a few times, based on much earlier mystical texts, the Zohar and the Arizal's writings, very beautiful idea that there needs to be some communication. In other words, every nation contains within it sparks of holiness and tremendously positive things. A Jew cannot be complete. The Jewish people cannot be complete without including those things. So there needs to be some interchange, which is why from every nation and every people, some people are destined to convert, to unite the salutary qualities of those nations and of those people with the Jewish people. But otherwise, everyone has their mission, and God gives everyone, as we say in Ethics of Our Fathers, a portion in the world to come, and even as far as divine vision and inspiration, as long as we fulfill our mission. And there's no reason to assume that someone has a mission other than we're created. So, therefore, we are not so much chosen as charged with an obligation, and we are not so much privileged as enabled. And this is the essence of chosenness. And therefore, the Torah reminds us that what's the litmus test of chauvinism? How you treat someone who joins the Jewish people, who is culturally, racially, and so on different from you. If you're a plain old chauvinist, you'll reject them. If you truly believe that it's a privilege and an obligation and something that is a burden you willingly take, you'll treat everyone who's a member of the covenant the same, which is how we began. These are, I think, the core ideas that we can build on an understanding of this issue.